All right, let's get more with my panel. Shia Franklin is a former executive of the World Jewish Congress and partner with Gotham Government Relations and Communications. And Matthew Brodsky is a senior fellow with the Security Studies Group. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Matthew, are the Palestinians intentionally ramping up violent attacks on Israelis ahead of the elections?
I think there are several factors here. One of them is the recent release of the report from the UN, which, when it comes to Israel, never does anything that's good. This kind of brings out more Palestinians to protest because it singled out Israel as it normally does. And again, they're going to be holding another meeting on March 18th at the UN Human Rights Council. This will again be an assault on Israel, and this will be followed on March 30th by Palestinian Land Day, which will be the one-year anniversary of these so-called March of Returns, which is really what has been the overall umbrella of the protest terror attacks that Hamas has been instructing. So this is probably going to be a well-timed uptick in violence to coincide with the election. But at the same time, I would be surprised if Hamas is actually looking to get into a far larger conflict militarily with Israel at the moment, because they've been working presently with certain rules of engagement with Netanyahu to avoid that kind of major escalation.
Shai, is Netanyahu likely to take more assertive action against Hamas ahead of the elections, or does he want to try and de-escalate the situation so that there won't be more unpredictability?
It is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, Netanyahu, well, first of all, there are specific security considerations when you need to attack, retaliate, prevent. But on the political level, Netanyahu can gain some support for bringing in the right-wing parties, this particular Kahana-inspired party, into his next coalition, for example, if he can say, look, we're being attacked. On the other hand, if he's saying that he's the security candidate, then the more that he fights back, the more it escalates, then things get out of control, perhaps. Then he looks like the dangerous candidate rather than the security candidate. So there's a little bit of a balance there on the political level. But I think Netanyahu ultimately will make these decisions based on security concerns. And
there are valid security concerns, Matthew, because Hamas is sending these explosives into Israel. They have started fires in the past that have resulted in millions of dollars worth of damages. Some of them have specifically targeted kindergartens. Now, so far there haven't been any severe injuries as a result of these balloon and kite explosives. But what is the correct way to respond to this?
Well, I think if you're Netanyahu, the correct way is to manage the conflict as best as he can. Of course, Israelis in previous rounds where there were large amounts of rockets being fired a few months back, many people in Israel were calling for a ground conflict, a ground incursion, which is something that Netanyahu has resisted. He has been risk averse, but again, Hamas has really chosen the protest movement, the balloons, the incendiary kites, these types of attacks as a middle ground to avoid a giant rocket escalation. And so Netanyahu has responded the way he has, with, of course, a couple strikes over the weekend in Gaza. I think this is the way the managed conflict looks, at least for now. But I think after the Israeli elections, anything can happen. And of course, it'll be hard for Hamas, if it decides that it wants to control any of the Palestinians, or so I should say, if it wants to prevent rather than control, it will find that more difficult when UN reports continually contribute to an atmosphere that just singles out Israel and provides more rhetorical ammunition.
Well, Matthew, you're touching on a number of issues, of course, that United Nations report receiving widespread condemnation from the United States as well as from Israel. Shai, what is Gantz's position on all of this? Because Netanyahu is positioning himself as the best person to be in charge of Israel's security. Gantz hasn't been that vocal about many of his policies. Do we know how he would react in a scenario like this?
You know how he would if he were prime minister?
If he were prime minister.
Well, we've seen his record when he was, running the Israeli army along with his colleagues. And in fact, Moshe Alon, who's in this coalition, was in fact also the defense minister. I think they would respond accordingly, try to manage it. I think they might warn the United States government not to put the East Jerusalem consulate under the U.S. Embassy to Israel. By moving the embassy to Israel, there was, let me put it this way.
Well, we will actually bring you back after the break to talk about moving the embassy to Jerusalem and another development with regards to the consulate there. We will be discussing that after the break. Also after the break, the latest on Venezuela as the opposition leader has returned to the country. ClearCut, welcome back. I'm Michelle Makori. The United States consulate in Jerusalem, which served as a de facto embassy for the Palestinians, has officially closed its doors and will be merged into the U.S. embassy to Israel. Now, from now on, the consul general will report to the U.S. ambassador to Israel in what seems like a way for the Trump administration to strengthen its ties to Prime Minister Netanyahu just weeks before the election. I-24 News correspondent Eilon Levy has more.
Not a merger, but an acquisition. Today, the U.S. mission to the Palestinians in Jerusalem was downgraded, becoming a Palestinian Affairs Unit under the new U.S. Embassy to Israel in Jerusalem. This building was always an international oddity. The U.S. mission to the Palestinians in the heart of West Jerusalem, one of only 2 consulates that answered directly to the State Department. Now, after a history that predated the State of Israel, and after decades as the U.S. liaison to the Palestinians, the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem on Agron Road has ceased to be an independent diplomatic mission.
We now have a diplomatic mission in Jerusalem for the embassy. It makes no sense to have 2 independent diplomatic missions in the same city. It's very inefficient.
But nobody is in doubt about the political implications. The United States and Palestinians now no longer have a direct line. U.S. diplomats speaking to the Palestinians must communicate through the ambassador to Israel.
The people are still there. The link is going to be preserved.
The jurisdiction of the U.S. Embassy in Israel will presumably now encompass the West Bank and Gaza Strip as well. The role of Consul General has been abolished and the current holder reposted. It's the latest in a long series of steps by the Trump administration to downgrade relations with the Palestinians. It slashed all direct aid, cut support for UNRWA to 0, and closed the PLO mission in Washington. The Mahmoud Abbas administration refuses to talk to the Americans and slammed the move as the final nail in the U.S. role in the peace process.
Mr. Trump will do everything possible to make it impossible for the Palestinians to deal with him and to deal with his deal of the century.
If we can't make our case to the leadership, we make our case to the Palestinian people.
The United States is hedging its bets, stressing that it continues to take no position on final status issues, including borders or boundaries, which are up to final status negotiations. As the Trump administration plans to roll out its deal of the century, can it pull off the trick of putting maximum pressure on the Palestinians and leaving them an opening just wide enough to walk through? Eilon Levy, I-24 News.
And I'm back with my panel. Shia Franklin, a former executive of the World Jewish Congress and partner with Gotham Government Relations and Communications, and Matthew Brodsky, a senior fellow with the Security Studies Group. Matthew, is this move to close the consulate about efficiency and eliminating redundancy, or is it intentionally done to downgrade the Palestinians, in your opinion?
I think it first corrects a historic imbalance in U.S. policy, but it also sends a very important message given the timing. This is somewhat detailed, but it's kind of important. Back in 1949, after the Israeli Independence War, Truman ended up, the administration, recognizing Israel within its expanded borders after the War of Independence, but didn't recognize any part of Jerusalem as being Israeli. That's when the U.S. decided to put its embassy in Tel Aviv. So the U.S. ended up having this consulate to address Palestinians in Jerusalem. So in essence, the United States, up until the Trump administration moved the embassy, was only representing itself, American interests, to Palestinians in the city of Jerusalem and not Israel. So this move right here essentially takes away that consulate as a separate entity dealing on a separate diplomatic channel with the United States and puts it, as it should be, under the U.S. Embassy, which also deals with Israel. The message I think it sends right now is that Palestinians who have been seeking to internationalize the conflict to the greatest extent it can by getting accolades at the UN and elsewhere, this really puts it down in front of them to say, you can try to get these type of trappings of statehood, but the fact is, unless you come to the table, you don't have a state.
Shai, do you agree? Is this really about rectifying the wrongs of the past and just about confirming the U.S.'s position that the embassy is now in Jerusalem and will handle all matters from there, Israeli and Palestinians?
In 1949, the West Bank was part of Jordan. It was controlled by Jordan. So this wasn't about recognizing.
It wasn't changed after '67 either, though.
I didn't interrupt you. Let me try to finish my.
Go ahead, Shai.
Thanks. Now that the United States has moved the embassy to Jerusalem, there's a lot of backlash within the Palestinian community. Moderates like Abbas are being undermined, as opposed to Hamas, which is becoming more consolidated, more popular. Most of the actions that Israel is taking in the West Bank and in Gaza are against Hamas. But there's an opportunity to maintain some communication with the Palestinians to try to build that back, to compensate for the change in the status quo by moving the embassy to Jerusalem, by having the consulate open and maintaining some form of communication with Palestinians. Now, if a year or two from now this peace plan of the century goes through, this deal of the century, then hopefully there would be an embassy to the new Palestinian state in Ramallah, let's say, or in some part of East Jerusalem. Why not wait a year or two and move this working level consulate when the time is right? Closing it, putting it under the U.S. Embassy to Israel is effectively annexing the West Bank to Israel.
Matthew, your response to this, why make this move now? Why not just wait?
Well, that's why I think it is very well designed to send a message to the Palestinian leadership, which, again, in their Palestinian Authority official newspaper, Al Hayat Al Jadida, just yesterday printed something where it compared Jason Greenblatt, our peace envoy, to a Mongoloid, apparently considering, it's not like the Palestinians have been dormant sitting there and that everything just happens to them. They're quite an active participant. So the U.S. was sending a message, and I also think that this happens to be diplomatically the correct maneuver, since Palestinians, in fact, don't have a state. And if they want to have a state, they need to come to the negotiating table and negotiate to get one. Right. And then, as your other guest said, of course, they could have a U.S. embassy in whatever their capital ends up being.
All right, Matthew Brodsky, Shia Franklin, we're going to have to leave it for now. Thank you so much for your time. Good stuff, as always. And to Venezuela now.